In the shadow of the steeple, I saw my people. By the relief office, I've seen my people. As they stood there hungry, I stood there asking, is this land made for you and me?
Hello and welcome to our first episode in our new series, Wayside Chat. My name is Sarah Bregman, and I will be your host. Wayside Chats is a new series dedicated to introducing the policy platform of Professor Emanuel E. Pastreich. Welcome to our series. I first learned about Professor Emanuel from a visiting professor at Vietnam Institute of Culture and Arts, Professor Jung. Now, all of us, Professor Jung, Professor Emanuel, and I all studied at Harvard at one point in time, and we all share an interest in East Asia political history. Professor Emanuel has achieved what few other Americans have tried and failed to do before him. He has a bachelor's degree from Yale College, magna cum laude, an MA, a master's degree from University of Tokyo, and a PhD from Harvard University, all in East Asian literature or comparative literature. Professor Emanuel is also fluent in Japanese, Chinese, Korean, French, and has basic conversational skills in German. So he is multilingual and has worked abroad in many different countries throughout East Asia throughout his career. He has additionally consulted for universities throughout the world. He has been engaged in a variety of projects to help provide policy recommendations for governments, and has been involved in various forms of activism recently related to global warming and climate change. And with that, I am confident to say that Professor Emanuel is highly qualified to run for President of the United States election. But what may surprise viewers the most is not your impressive academic history, but rather the fact that you came from a modest Midwest upbringing. So, Professor Emanuel, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your upbringing, if I may, and also how did a Midwestern boy become so passionate about East Asia?
Well, it's really an honor to be here with you today, Sarah, and to be addressing everybody out there and to see if we can put forth a vision together for what our country can be, and starting in the middle of it. I was born in Nashville. I grew up in St. Louis, although I lived in Kansas City as an infant. And I then taught at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, for 8 years in my career. So it's actually the longest part of my life has been in the Midwest. And Asia was not a part of that growing up, really. But I felt very strongly when I got to college that the future of the economy and culture and geopolitics was going to be about Asia in my lifetime, and that it was critical for me as an American to have a real understanding. That is to say, it's not enough for us as Americans to simply to be able to say ni hao or konnichiwa, but that we have to have at least as profound understanding of the culture, the languages, the politics and society of the countries of East Asia, so that we can take them seriously, and that we also, in this day and age, and this is even more self-evident today, can, with a certain degree of humility, say that if countries like Korea or Japan or Vietnam or China or other countries have practices which are valuable, or technologies or ideas, or for that matter, philosophy or literature or culture that we can learn from, that we should be, as Americans, ready to accept and to learn what it's better. After all, that's, I mean, for that matter, how Japan or Korea reached such economic success, was precisely their willingness to learn from abroad.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. And in fact, I also was a Midwestern girl who studied in Kansas and originally studied at University of Kansas. And I joined Korean studies for exactly the same reason. But there was one other part for me, and I wonder if the same may be true for you, is when I was growing up in the Midwest, exactly for me, it was in the early 2000s, I saw
Right.
a lot of news stories demonizing countries in East Asia,
Right.
particularly North Korea.
Right.
Now, you have written about North Korea in Korean
Right.
for a Korean audience, and you've talked about this as a kind of fantasy. And you're
Right.
trying to challenge this narrative. And so I'd like to begin here with another question before we continue about the problems of representation in the media of East Asian countries. Could you offer your thoughts on that for us?
Right. Well, this is an enormous challenge for us as Americans, ordinary Americans. We're fed images, especially of North Korea, this threatening, sort of fantastic uh, uh, tyranny that is out to get us. But that image of East Asia as a threat spills over into how China, or for that matter, I think Asia in general is represented in the United States. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves about this as a dishonest representation and a way to manipulate us. That what we really need to be doing is to look out for our national interests of the United States. But the national interest of the United States involves not pretending that China or North Korea or other countries are demons and we should stay away from them. The national interest of the United States is for us to understand these countries, to understand what parts we can learn from, which parts we don't want to learn from, and how we can work with them to protect our own interests. And if we dismiss them out of hand, or we live in some fantasy world of North Korea as this monster in order to justify massive military budgets for weapons, which are in many cases absolutely useless, that we are just digging our own graves. The only future for the United States is an objective, scientific analysis of the world in general, and for East Asia specifically. You better understand it before you make any sort of snap judgments.
I think that especially with COVID-19 and this current
Yes.
outbreak, we've seen United States leaders' ignorance of Asia once again. And this is not just a problem of the Trump administration. In fact,
Absolutely not.
for any Korean speaker, they will recall a speech by President Obama during his administration in which he incorrectly greeted the leader of South Korea by saying, "You are not welcome." He used the words "안 환영합니다," and I still remember that speech. So there's a lot of problems, not just with the Trump administration or conservative governments, but in fact with the Democratic administrations as well.
One of the important points and about running as independent is I have absolutely no interest in demonizing Donald Trump, and I have no interest in trying this good cop, bad cop routine, which is so common, especially with Democrats, but with Republicans in their own ways too. That our main purpose is to seek out the truth and assert what is in the long-term interests of the United States. That's really the bottom line for us.
Right.
And this,
most
go ahead.
candidates speak about the national interests. And so I'm
Right.
glad that you mentioned this. And your platform and the two platforms or the pillars of your campaign are seeking truth and protecting freedom. And I wonder
Absolutely.
if you could speak about that for a moment for everyone and explain what you mean by that.
Right. Well, we are challenged, all of us as Americans, by a tremendous confusion. We're bombarded with misleading stories, and that's just as true for conservative as it is for so-called progressive media. And we have slipped into this sort of fantasy world of unreliable information, and that it's not a fun game anymore. It's actually being used as the basis for policy, and we now have essentially the entire newspaper is full of reports about COVID-19, while many trillions of dollars are being transferred from your bank account essentially to the accounts of investment banks and multinational corporations. So the investigation of truth, assertion of what is true, is the most critical point. If we don't know what is true, even if our intentions are good, even if we're trying to save our country, we can be easily misled and misdirected in a dangerous direction. So that's I think the core issue is the careful scientific investigation of what is accurate and true.
Now, I think on that, there are some critics on the liberal side who would immediately question what you mean by truth. And as a literature professor, I think you're very qualified to speak about the meaning of truth here. So could you offer your thoughts about the future of objective knowledge and the difference between what feminists would call positionality or the multiplicity of truth? What's the difference here?
Right. Well, we're talking today with a large range of Americans. I don't expect anybody to have gone to graduate school or taken classes in philosophy. In fact, I have the ultimate respect for all of you who have learned about how the world works through your daily life, through your work, through your children, through your family. And I make no presumption whatsoever that I in any way understand the world better than you do. But I just want to stress that when we are moving forward to try and deal with a profound crisis that our country faces today, that there is some sense in which we can identify and pursue scientific truth. That is to say, what actually happened in a relatively accurate way. Now, scientific investigation itself is imperfect, and it requires constant experimentation and confirmation, and interpretations will vary, as is true in the study of history. However, I would say that effort of sort of in journalism and in education to try and ascertain what is actually happening and what are its actual implications for us, that this has almost vanished from the media, from a political discussion, and to a large degree has vanished from education, which has moved away from an investigation of things to a providing qualifications for a job, right? So you don't actually go to school in order to learn how to think for yourself, how to understand the world, but rather just to get a degree that will allow you to get the job which will feed you and your family. Or for that matter, that the media is encouraging you either in a sort of a conservative perspective on the world or a so-called progressive perspective on the world, but it's not actually teaching you how to think or to understand how the world works. And the classic example of this is the COVID-19 crisis today, in which you have wall-to-wall progressive, liberal, conservative broadcast. None of it is actually giving you any detail of what viruses are, how they reproduce, what the standard accepted practices for responding to them, and what the health issues are for the average American. And this means that people are confused, rightfully confused, because the media is not journalism, education is not about the search for truth, and this has resulted in tremendous chaos where ordinary people like us, we've been fortunate enough to go to graduate school and get good educations. But that was not something to be proud of. It comes with it, brings with it an obligation to do our best to help you, to help ordinary people to understand the world. And unfortunately, whether it's journalism or professors or politicians or other pundits, increasingly do not see their role as helping people to understand this confusion, but if anything, playing a integral role in perpetrating the confusion and uncertainty for very short-term political and economic purposes.
That leads me to the next question I'd like to ask, and I'm sure a lot of Americans are wondering the same thing, is why are you announcing your campaign now, and why are you announcing your position as an independent?
Right. So thank you for that question. And this is, in some ways, the critical question. So I decided to write, I was in Washington, D.C., trying very hard to help regarding Asia policy, and I hit a total brick wall where I couldn't really work or do anything anymore in the three-ring circus that was called impeachment. And I decided that we really needed some serious alternative to what was out there. And that I looked at the whole spectrum of what was being discussed, and I felt that none of the politicians in Washington, D.C. were making an effort to address the sort of four, as I say, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The four greatest threats that we face have been totally ignored. And none of the politicians that I met or the policymakers or the think tank people were making any effort to engage with ordinary people and to listen to them or to explain to them the world and what the problems are. And I felt that we'd reached a degree of sort of decadence and a sort of a indulgence, cultural narcissism, where it starts to look sort of like a Nero's Rome. So I thought if I made this declaration, that I could start a dialogue in which we would go forward, and I could maybe play a role which was unique. I have no money. I literally have no money. I have no interest. I'm not backed by any billionaires or even millionaires or even 100,000aires. And I'm doing this entirely because of my belief that the American people are capable of doing better. And I believe that it's not my role as a candidate to talk down to people, but rather to lift them up, to say that you as a citizen are capable of rising to the occasion and getting our country back on track.
I'd really like to highlight that for a moment for everyone, because a lot of the other candidates that run, they have one thing in common that they may not be fully aware of. Even the independent candidate who gained tremendous traction, Bernie Sanders, has tremendous amounts of money at his disposal to mobilize people to join his campaign. Whereas that's really contradictory to the entire idea of grassroots organizing. If you have money to be able to pay people to support your campaign, then it undermines the entire effort or the idea of participatory democracy. And I think that is one of the things that really makes your campaign unique.
Right. Well, this is a very important point in terms of my background, I should say, I grew up, my father was the manager of the St. Louis Symphony, first the Nashville Symphony, then Kansas City, and then the St. Louis. So I grew up in a relatively well-off environment, but not rich by any means. But when my parents were divorced, I lived with my mother in Benton Park in the city in St. Louis with very little money. And I had that critical experience, which I'm very thankful for, of knowing what it's like not to be able to essentially have anything other than the basics of just feeding yourself and going to school. And I have later in life, I had ups and downs, but I have always felt at some deep level that the benefits I received in terms of my education, that these bring with them a profound responsibility. And I have to be honest, I was a bit disappointed to see how many of my colleagues, whether in academics or classmates at Yale or Harvard, have essentially decided to have their vacations in Italy, go for the weekends, out to Bar Harbor, or to have nice French dinners every so often, and not to concern themselves with the front line, which is addressing this profound moral, cultural, and political crisis that our country faces. And so, in a way, declaring myself as independent and taking this position was to say, um, uh, I will go forward, right? And that this is my responsibility. It involves a considerable amount of risk. It certainly doesn't bring me any money, but that's what you or I, as people who had the great benefit to actually learn specialized fields of knowledge, this is when we have to rise to the occasion and bring with us, all of you who are out there, participatory democracy. Maybe I could just say a word about that.
I'd love for you to comment on what you mean by participatory democracy.
Right. So it's a much used term and by different experts, but I want to stress there's one professor, Theda Skopel, at MIT, who wrote a book called Diminished Democracy, from Participation to Management. And in her book, she lays out how democracy has been undermined and destroyed over the last 60 years because it has become essentially a show. That in the old days, and I'm not saying that the old days in the United States were, I'm not taking making America great again. There are obviously profound issues or problems in America, but there were some strong, important points in America's tradition. And I'm neither a progressive nor a conservative, or you could say I am both a conservative and a progressive. And I'm conservative in the sense that the participatory systems in the United States, whether it was the Grange or other associations for farmers, the Lions Club or the Rotary Club or the YMCA or the League of Women's Voters or a variety, or Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, etc. There was a large range of participatory organizations in the United States which allowed citizens to meet with each other on a weekly basis to practice democracy in terms of electing their local president or chairman, and to constantly be engaged in a administrative policies within their local organizations.
I
And what has
absolutely
happened,
agree.
and what has happened to us sadly over the last 40 years, while we slept, is that all these organizations have essentially been gutted. So that what you have today is me, the individual, often alone, even alienated from my family and friends, and all I have is my cell phone, my TV, internet, the mall, and 7-Eleven and McDonald's, and there's nothing participatory. And at the highest level, up there, somewhere in the sky, above the clouds, there's the president, the Senate, the Congress, the governor, whatever, but there's nothing participatory that links me to them. And so someone like Bernie Sanders, who you mentioned, who spent a lot of time talking about how we would be creating this new society, I can tell you, and I challenge you, try and reach Bernie Sanders. Try and find anybody of your friends on Facebook or anywhere else or in your neighborhood who can get you in contact with a secretary or a associate or a friend of Bernie Sanders, so you can get your ideas across to Bernie Sanders and have him listen to you. And I can tell you in advance, not don't want to disappoint you, but you cannot do it. But these
Absolutely.
people are totally cut off from you. They'll ask for your money. Bernie has no problem with that, as is true for many other of these organizations, but they're non-participatory. But in the United States, and we have some great traditions, like the Grange, like the YMCA, like Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, in which there was a strong participatory organizations at the local level, which linked you to citizen, to your family, to your community, and all the way up to the president.
That's absolutely the point of a participatory democracy, or even a representative democracy, should be that our voices are being listened to. But in fact, what we're seeing in the United States, really for the past several decades, are presidents being elected not based on the popular vote, but based on the electoral college. And this is another kind of problem that many proponents for independence have raised. And there's a lot of skeptics who say that if you run as an independent, you have no chance, that the system is rigged already. So what would you say to them?
Well, I think this campaign itself is a challenge to the entire system. So we start with the assumption that the entire election system is rigged from the beginning. That if you don't have big money, which usually means support from major investment banks like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, BlackRock, and other groups at some level, that you cannot appear in the commercial media, and you can't get your message across, and no one's going to ever know who you are, and that's the assumption. So if you don't, it's a pay-to-play game, and many of these so-called, whether they're, and I should say a word on this issue of progressive and conservative here, because we should not, as American citizens, allow ourselves to be caught up in this false dichotomy. Conservative in the sense of having deep spiritual values, an emphasis on the capacity of humans to find, to hold up traditions and to live a moral, correct life, is something for which I have profound respect and which has actually been very important to me. And although I don't attend a particular church, prayer and God is important in my life. On the other hand, the progressive perspective to say that we can include more people, that we can create a fairer world in which we don't have this terrible concentration of wealth, in which there's not discrimination against people for arbitrary and unfair reasons. This is also something which appeals to me deeply, and I don't find these two perspectives to be at odds with each other, in fact. So I think all of us, I mean, the whole point of not being associated is being independent is, one, we don't buy into this false dichotomy. Two, we're not affiliated with these two parties, which have become both so deeply corrupt that they're essentially incapable of formulating any meaningful policy for you and me. But the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and other parties, I mean, there have been other strong parties in our past in the United States, had a time when they were not like that. And we know that now the Republican Party, which seems to be willing to go along with any number of atrocities that Ike Eisenhower was capable of standing up against the military-industrial congressional complex and warning of the dangers of endless foreign wars, and that there were Democrats as well, whether it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt or John F. Kennedy or others, who also stood up for what I would say were conservative values. And there was a complexity and engagement and participatory quality in American politics before, not perfect, but that we can, going forward, both learn from what we have achieved before in American history and also change it and improve it to address the new challenges that we face.
And I would say the other part of an independent's role in the American presidential election is really to raise key issues that are being ignored by the two main parties, and often the issues that are the most important and key to really changing American society. And in your campaign, um, next week in our talk, we'll talk more about each particular aspect of your platform. But today, I want to really highlight what's different about your presidential bid. And you as a candidate, two of the features of your campaign that I find really meaningful is your interest in internationalism and also your view on economic policy. Now, I would say that internationalism is often misunderstood in the United States by well educated Americans as well as ordinary Americans, and they often confuse internationalism with globalism.
Right.
Now, the Trump administration has been a very vocal critic of globalists,
Right.
whereas the progressives often seem to stand for globalism. Now, I wonder if you could offer the third alternative here and explain what is the meaning of internationalism and
Right.
why is that so important in your.
Right. Well, it's a critical point, and it has. I think the Trump administration now has gotten much traction for its entirely legitimate critique of globalist policies. Sadly, however, it has only offered us a how would I say a chocolate covered, a chocolate coated form of globalism. It hasn't actually changed the game at all. So internationalism would be an effort to build true alliances of committed citizens, committed intellectuals, or people with strong ethical commitment around the world to work on critical issues. And the most critical, of course, being global warming and climate change, the drive for war to bring peace and to end these endless wars, the misuse of finance and of money, and resulting in this tremendous concentration of wealth. We know just in the last 2 weeks, while millions of Americans were thrown out of work or bankrupted, that the top 5 billionaires have added $4 or $5 billion apiece to their wealth as a result of this sham. Uh, and that this is really what we need to be focused on. Unfortunately, more often than not, what has been seen as international has in fact been globalism. That is to say, the coming together of investment banks, multimillionaires, multinational corporations to pursue their interests, usually under the title of free trade or free investment, sometimes in the theme of security and alliances, which has been driven not by a need to build international alliances of concerned citizens or experts or ethically committed people, but rather an alliance of those who are in the pursuit of their own personal financial benefits.
And if I may, I want to mention here when you mentioned the cash out of the group of billionaires.
Right.
Um, and additionally, at the same time, we have the underfunding and the defunding of the World Health Organization. And I wonder if you could offer your comments on what you think is going on there. Why do you think the Trump administration underfunded or decided to stop sending funding to the World Health Organization? And what does
Right.
that mean for America's policy, foreign policy?
Right. Well, I think the most important thing here for you as the citizens of America is that going forward in my campaign, it's going to be, we're going to have to do it together, right? That you're going to have to uh, raise your ability up to understand these various games that politicians play. Uh, I have no interest in doing a Bernie Sanders miracle work to say, if you elect me, I'll solve your problems. I think the hard work is going to be for all of us together to figure out what's going on. and to make real proposals, which we will enact at the local level amongst us to move forward. Regarding the World Health Organization and the current debate with the Trump administration, I think it's again something of a drama or play set up for us. The World Health Organization plays an important role globally, but it has been infected and undermined by reduced budgets from various donor governments and the ability of wealthy corporations or individuals to buy interest and to distort its role through their influence. So when the Trump administration criticizes the UN or the World Health Organization or other global organizations as being corrupt or not effective, the criticism is not 100% wrong. There is something to it. And I don't want to buy into this reflexive defense of the United Nations or other organizations because they have been corrupted. On the other hand, we have to recognize that what the other side is trying to do, and it's not Donald Trump. I've never met Donald Trump, but I don't believe that these initiatives come from him. And I think we've entered into a very, very dangerous game in which all sorts of other hidden forces do nefarious things to undermine our democracy, our economy, and the global economy. And then they say, oh, Donald Trump did it. I don't think we should allow ourselves to be fooled. But the agenda is clear. Destroy government. Destroy government. Destroy global governance in terms of the United Nations and other organizations, which have done a good job to address issues like disease globally. They could have done a better job, but the fact that they haven't done as good a job has to do a lot with the decay of government at the local level in the United States, at the national level. And in the United States, government has ceased to play the role that it once did, and it has become increasingly a toy of the wealthy and of corporations.
I'd like to comment on one more point about this before we move on to the kind of economic factors is what do you think these days in America about this ignorance of the world? It really is, it's ignorance or it's a disinterest, an absolute disinterest in what's happening outside of the United States. We saw this in the response to COVID-19. We see this with the distrust of the World Health Organization, which has there are some valid concerns related to who is involved in these international organizations these days. But the point here is what could the United States do better by adopting a really comparative perspective and understanding and listening to its neighbors throughout the world, and particularly in East Asia?
Right. Well, I think we have an enormous amount to learn from other countries around the world, and that we should take all of them, I mean, basically, as potential partners going forward. We should not approach it with any sort of ideological tinted glasses. It's ultimately a healthy and a constructive approach to international relations has to start with us, the citizens, right? That we have been subject. And this is, I think, the core issue which politicians in general avoid, because to talk about it means you're not going to be in anybody's show anymore, is that there's been a concerted effort by various wealthy individuals and corporations to dumb down the American people, to feed us these simplistic stories, to discourage us from understanding and pursuing knowledge, to make us dependent on them as miracle workers or magicians who will solve our problems for us. That we will vote every 4 years for somebody, that person will then solve our problems for us, and we should not be involved in trying to make a better world until we vote. And then after we vote, we'll leave it to whoever it is. And if they don't do what we hope they would do, then we'll vote for somebody else. This is a recipe for disaster. And it's not how the United States has always been run. And I think it was a systematic effort. And it was driven largely by the industry of public relations and advertising, who essentially sold themselves, in which citizens are just fed information and given these choices, which we present them. Democrat, Republican, Pepsi, Coke, and this is what that advertising, that public relations is about. And it has had a tremendous negative effect. And I think Americans right now, because it's gotten so out of hand, where you turn on the TV and you think, we think, you think, this doesn't make any sense. It can't possibly be true what these people are telling me. And we're forced to say that something has gone profoundly, profoundly wrong.
And I think there's some strength in a lot of Americans who tend to be bipartisan, and they choose a side. Something that they're lacking is this comparative view, because you and I, having worked in East Asia now for many years, and in many different East Asian countries, and having worked with people in the governments of these countries, we see that it's not simple. It's not a this or that issue, and there's an alternative. And really, I think that's something that this comparative perspective that you bring has to offer the American people. It's understanding that a comparative perspective and understanding how governments in other places are doing things can really help strengthen the U.S. national interest. It will make our hospitals better. It will improve our healthcare system. It will show us an alternative to currently in the United States, the healthcare system is leaving now a large proportion of the population without health insurance during a pandemic. Because their insurance is tied to their employment, and now because employment is
to pay
just
$2,000, $3,000 a month just to have
over the cost of insurance is absolutely absurd. Whereas in a country like South Korea or even Vietnam, the government manages the healthcare system in a way that's not socialist or communist or capitalist. It's just a different way of running the healthcare system that works.
Right. Well, I in my speeches and in my writing, I try and avoid these terms: socialist, communist, capitalist, imperialist, because they're both extremely loaded and they're not well understood, and I don't pretend to understand them myself. And I'm much more valuable for us to just look concretely at what the issues are.
Absolutely.
The critical issue here is what the role of government is. And in Asia, I think to a larger degree, we have a healthier sense that government can play a role in society. There's a long tradition of a positive role for government in East Asia, which in fact inspired both the United States and Great Britain and France. In the 18th century, a lot of the ideas about what we call democracy came from a study of the meritocracy, civil service systems of East Asia. But I think more importantly, in the United States, we have been subject by these public relations and advertising firms and consultants paid by the super rich who have fed us this line that all the bad things that happen are because of government. And this, of course, government can be cruel and terrible, just as corporations or anything else can be. However, government can also play the role as a check against the rich and the powerful, and that's what it's done traditionally in East Asia, and what it's often done in the West. And that this is what we are losing now, that now government, even 20, 30 years ago, deeply flawed, by the way, over the last few years, but still had something of a regulatory ability to stand up to protect the little man, little woman, and ability to protect or to encourage those who pursue truth and expose corruption and pursue the national interest.
I would say that in East Asia especially, we see that in South Korea in recent years, we saw the impeachment and arrest of Park Geun-hye,
Right.
for corruption. And South Korea is a democracy for many people who are unfamiliar with East Asian politics. And in Vietnam, we see the arrest of top government leaders. We see
Right.
the arrest and imprisonment of anyone who mixes business with politics,
Right.
really. And this sense of corruption and the sense of justice against people who use their monetary wealth and power is a very strong tradition in East Asia.
Absolutely.
Regardless of whether you call the Asian country a communist country or a socialist country or a democracy, these terms have very little meaning in the actual everyday practices of governance of these societies.
Right. So these terms, these ideological terms, I mean, maybe they're helpful for some people, and I don't want to judge, but for us, the essential issues are that we should protect the freedom of citizens, that we should assure equal opportunity and a balanced, just, and equitable society. And that East Asia, I feel, I mean, as someone who's worked, as we've worked on this field, has much to offer in its tradition, and that much of the best of the tradition in the United States was, in fact, linked both to traditions from East Asia imported that led to Rousseau and the discussion about the balance of powers in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, and also on the other side in the native peoples of the United States, of the Americas, like the Iroquois, Navajo, these nations had a participatory, sustainable society, and the Iroquois Confederation's Constitution had profound influence on the U.S. Constitution, something which we, I think, are often unaware of.
And this really brings me, aside from the influence or the role of government in society, which is the first main feature that unites your platform and ties it together. But the second major issue is this issue of economics and government, which
Right.
is traditionally regarded and even demonized as a conservative issue. People
Right.
who don't care about social issues, they only care about economics, they only care about money. This tends
Right.
to be a negative representation of the conservatives in the United States.
Right.
But that's one of the very interesting parts of your platform, is that on the one hand, you're in favor of international cooperation
Right.
for the interest of the United States.
Correct.
And simultaneously, you're promoting economic reform. And so I'd really like you to speak for a moment about your economic policy and your vision for reform in the United States.
Right. Well, there's a famous phrase which is think globally, act locally, and I really do believe strongly in that perspective, which is to say that we need people who understand the world, that we need to be working together with our peers in Vietnam or in Germany, in South Africa, or in China, or for that matter, in Russia. But at the same time, that once we have that vision and that cooperative sort of network, alliance, that at the day-to-day basis, we have to be concerned with where we are right now. And that addressing this destruction of the environment and this terrible consumption, extraction culture is going to have to happen at the local level, and that we're going to have to move beyond the very, very dangerous and I think taboo subjects to address for politicians, and those are militarism, military buildup, and the free trade fairy tale. On the first part, military, this idea that we have to build all these weapon systems for trillions, billions and billions of dollars around the world, is in order to defend ourselves, in order to bring security, is simply not true. And the United States and in other countries as well, the United States used to be that between wars or conflicts, the military went down to being a skeleton crew, which is the way it should be. This idea that you have to maintain an enormous army constantly for 30, 40, 60, 70 years, ready for a world war any day, is incredibly destructive. It's destroyed the American economy.
I would say that anti-war for viewers does not mean anti-military.
Yeah, no,
There's many
absolutely.
possible uses for military that and the army in the United States that go well beyond fighting in a war.
Right. So, and I think this is very, I mean, this is a subject maybe for another discussion, but I'll say this much. At any time in a nation history, we face challenges like today, and we need people who are brave enough to stand up for critical issues and who are willing to give their lives in the pursuit of national interest, in pursuit of truth, in pursuit of justice. Sadly, over the last 20 years, many people who are willing to do that have had their efforts and their goodwill misdirected for very, very selfish and inappropriate ends.
So really, I think for the next talk, we'll focus more in depth on all of these issues. And today, I hope that viewers were able to get a better sense of who you are, what you stand for, and how you compare to the progressive parties, Democratic institution, Republican institution, and I think it can help them understand why now. And so the final question I'd really like to ask before we go is why now? What are
Why
the
now?
events or the issues that led you to put your name in for
Right.
the presidential election?
Right. Well, there's there were several reasons why I decided to take this step, but I think the most important one was that the entire game in politics in the United States. I mean, politics has become a dirty word, right? It didn't have to be that way, but it's all been focused on this narcissistic uh, uh, three-ring circus, which is to say, you have to follow me, give me money, and I I will present good images for you on the internet or on the news, and then you will vote for me in November, and then that's the end, right? And that I feel that if this is the model, that there's no candidate who's going to help us to get out of this sort of a crisis. That the only way for the United States to start moving in a healthy direction is if we start to build participatory organizations at the local level where you, your family members, your neighbors meet regularly and you discuss what are we going to do about energy, about the environment, about our city, our town on a daily basis. And once you build these organizations, which are strong, which are well organized at the local level, tying you together as a group, then you will have power. That is real power. The power does not come from sending Bernie Sanders $15 through PayPal. The power will come when you are organized, at least, this is what Martin Luther King said, and I think, of course, it wasn't his idea, it goes far back, but he says, if there are forces for war that you oppose, we have to be, in order to stop those wars, or that economic exploitation, or that concentration of wealth, if we want to stop it, we, as ordinary citizens, have to be at least as well organized, at least as inspired as those forces are if we want to stop them. And so my campaign is not about me. It doesn't matter what happens to me. It doesn't matter if I'm elected or not elected. In fact, the main thing is to try and use this opportunity to focus, to say that as the Constitution tells us, as Abraham Lincoln repeated with his comment, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that this is not about magicians and saviors. It's about ordinary people who are able to raise their understanding and their thinking, to have a spiritual power within themselves, and to themselves promote institutions that are participatory from the grassroots up. And if we do that, whether the president is Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whoever, they will listen to what we tell them to do.
And with that, I'd really like to invite everyone listening today to start a conversation with us. That's what this is all about. We want everyone to join us and participate in this discussion for a better America.
Nobody living can ever make me turn back. This land was made for you and